The emergency bulkhead sealed with a sound that made every species in the corridor flinch. It was not the sharp hiss of decompression or the panicked blare of alarms that followed. It was the sound of mass settling into place. A deep, grinding tum that resonated through the deck plates and into bone and nerve. The kind of sound that said something very large had just decided it was not moving again anytime soon. Red lights ignited along the ceiling. Atmosphere loss warnings scrolled across wall displays. The corridor's environmental field stabilized just enough to keep everyone alive, for now. And between us and the nearest safe section stood the door. It was enormous. The emergency bulkhead was a Class V containment seal, designed for worst-case scenarios. Hull breaches, reactor failures, boarding actions by hostile megafauna. It was a slab of layered alloy and composite ceramics nearly a meter thick, mounted on reinforced rails sunk directly into the station's structural spine. When closed, it locked mechanically as well as electronically, relying on mass and friction rather than delicate systems that could fail under stress. In simple terms, it was not a door. It was a wall. Bulkhead sealed. The station announced calmly, as if this were routine. Manual override unavailable. Structural integrity priority engaged. The translation systems rendered the same message into 12 languages, all of which carried the same meaning. You are not going through. Panic followed predictably. A Brunei security officer rushed forward first, muscles bunching beneath thick hide, and slammed both forelimbs against the seam. The impact echoed uselessly. The door did not shift. Sensors didn't even register a meaningful load. "It's locked," someone shouted. "It's not locked," an engineer snapped back. "It's sealed." A vortex tried next, bracing 3 arms against the frame while the other 3 dug into the deck for leverage. Their species could lift ground vehicles on their homeworld. The force readings spiked briefly, then plateaued far below the threshold. "Impossible," the vortex hissed, backing away in disbelief. A Colrith attempted a resonance tool. A Kelpie floated closer, probing the field with delicate pressure tendrils. A Threxian ran rapid calculations on a wrist display, their mandibles clicking faster with each failed equation. "It's rated beyond biological limits," the Threxian announced. "No known species can generate the torque required to overcome static friction at this mass." "How long until rescue?" someone asked. 10 minutes, the station replied. "Minimum." The oxygen counter ticked down. 7 minutes of breathable air remained in the corridor. That was when the human spoke. They said, stepping closer to the bulkhead. "This is the emergency door, right?" Several heads turned. "Yes," the engineer said sharply. "And it cannot be opened." The human frowned, not in fear, not in panic, but in mild confusion. They leaned forward, peering at the seam where the door met the frame. "Then why does it look like it's jammed?" Silence followed. "Jammed?" the Brunei repeated. "Yeah," the humans said, crouching slightly, running their fingers along the lower edge. "See how it's sitting uneven? There's scoring here, like it twisted when it dropped." "It's sealed under optimal parameters," the engineer said. "It is functioning as designed." The human rocked back on their heels. "Okay, but functioning doesn't mean aligned." Several displays flickered as the human placed both hands against the door, not pushing yet, just touching. Pressure sensors activated automatically, registering contact. "What are you doing?" someone demanded. "Checking resistance," the human replied absently. "Feels wrong." They pushed lightly. The force spike registered instantly. Not enough to matter, but enough to make the room go quiet. The human blinked. Pushed again. Slightly harder. The door groaned. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. The sound sent a chill through the corridor. "That," the Threxian stammered, staring at the readings. "That shouldn't." The human stepped back, rolling their shoulders. "Yeah, it's definitely stuck." No one spoke. No one moved. Because the door, rated impossible, classified immovable, designed with the absolute certainty that no living thing would ever try to muscle it, had just responded. And the human was no longer asking if it could be opened. They were wondering why no one else had tried fixing it. The engineer recovered first, because engineers always did. Panic was inefficient. Denial was unproductive. They snapped their focus back to the data feeds scrolling across their console, mandibles tightening as numbers updated far too quickly for comfort. That movement was incidental, they said, more to the room than to the human. Localized stress response, not displacement. The Threxian's claws danced across the display. Force vectors, structural tolerances, friction coefficients recalculated. In real time, the numbers did not agree with the explanation, and that disturbed them more than the groaning metal ever could. The door weighs 97 metric tons. The engineer continued, voice firm. Static friction alone requires a force output exceeding the maximum muscular potential of any known species by a factor of, they paused, recalculating, by a factor of 6. The human nodded, listening politely. Okay. Therefore, the engineer finished. It cannot be moved by biological effort. Around them, the corridor buzzed with uneasy agreement. Limits were comforting. Limits were how civilizations survived. Every species present had grown up learning where their bodies failed, where physics stopped listening to intention. Those limits shaped architecture, emergency doctrine, even language. You did not try to lift a bulkhead any more than you tried to outrun vacuum. The human crouched again. Can you not? The Kalrith asked, alarm edging into their voice. If you continue stressing the seal, it could fail catastrophically. I'm not lifting it, the human replied. I'm testing it. That distinction is meaningless, the Brenai rumbled. Force is force. Not really, the human said, placing a hand against the frame this time instead of the door. Force direction matters. They leaned in, eyes tracing the rails embedded into the deck and ceiling. See these? They're supposed to be parallel. But the impact twisted the frame. That means part of the door's weight is binding instead of settling. The engineer bristled. The system autocorrects for ideal conditions, the human interrupted gently. Not warped ones. They pressed their shoulder into the door and pushed, not straight, but angled. The sensor screamed. Alarms changed tone, shifting from atmospheric warnings to structural stress alerts. The force readings spiked into ranges that made several species instinctively recoil. That load is asymmetrical, the Threxian shouted. Stop. The door shifted again. Barely. A whisper of movement. But unmistakable. A vortex fainted. That reading exceeds rated biological output, the engineer said, voice suddenly thin. You cannot generate that much force. The human exhaled sharply, muscles trembling under the strain. I'm not generating it all at once, they said between breaths. I'm stacking it. Stacking force? The Kalrith echoed. Leverage, the human corrected. Micro-movements. Letting it settle, then pushing where it binds. Like opening a warped hatch on a shipwreck. The engineer stared. That is not a standard emergency procedure. No, the human agreed. Because usually the door isn't stuck. It's just closed. Sweat beaded along the human's brow now. Their breathing had changed, slower, deeper, deliberate. Pain flickered across their face, quickly mastered. The monitors picked up rising strain in muscle groups not designed for sustained maximum output. You will injure yourself, the Brenai warned. Yeah, the human said. Probably. Then stop. The human paused, pressing their forehead briefly against the cool metal. How much air do we have left? They asked. For minutes, the station replied. The human nodded. That's why I'm not stopping. They shifted their stance, bracing one foot against the frame, hands repositioning lower, where friction was highest. When they pushed this time, it was not explosive. It was controlled, relentless, a steady application of effort that made the metal scream in protest. The door moved another fraction. Enough for light to leak through the seam. Enough for the impossible to become undeniable. The engineer's console chimed, updating calculations that now bordered on incoherent. This scenario was never accounted for. They whispered. No, the human said hoarsely. Because you designed the door assuming no one would try to fight it. They stepped back at last, chest heaving, arms shaking violently. I can't lift it, they admitted. Not like this. Hope flickered, and then dimmed. But, the human added, glancing at the widening gap, I don't think we need to. The corridor fell silent again, because everyone present had just watched the galaxy's most trusted assumption crack under human hands. Strength, it turned out, did have limits. But effort, applied intelligently and without fear of pain, that was something else entirely. The gap did not look impressive. It was a thin, uneven line of light along the lower third of the bulkhead, no wider than a few fingers at its broadest point. To most of the species in the corridor, it meant nothing. You could not crawl through it. You could not pry it open with tools rated for maintenance, let alone bare limbs. The door was still a wall. A slightly flawed wall, perhaps, but a wall all the same. The human stared at it as if it were an answer. Don't celebrate, the engineer snapped, though their voice lacked conviction. That displacement is meaningless. The seal is still engaged. I know, the human said. They crouched again, this time not touching the door at all. They studied the rails. The ceiling mount. The way the door sat a few degrees off, true, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it. You see it now, right? The human asked. See what? The Kalrith demanded. The bind, the human replied. It's not uniform. The top rail is taking most of the load. That means the bottom's carrying friction it wasn't designed for. The Threxian frowned, running a fresh scan. That configuration would require a corrective realignment system too. They stopped mid-sentence, mandibles clicking. The corrective system is offline. Exactly, the human said. So the door isn't sealed the way it's supposed to be. It's wedged. The word rippled through the corridor. Wedged. It implied something different from sealed. Sealed meant finality. Wedged meant pressure. Tension. The possibility, however small, of change. We don't have tools rated for that kind of stress, the Brenai said. Even if you could shift it more, you'd need leverage. The human looked around. Their gaze landed on a fallen emergency brace, torn loose when the bulkhead slammed down. It was a thick alloy strut, half buried under debris, designed to reinforce docking clamps. Too heavy for most species to lift. Too awkward to maneuver in a narrowing corridor. The human walked over to it and tested the weight with one hand. They winced. Okay, they muttered. That's heavier than I hoped. What are you doing? The engineer asked, alarm rising again. Looking for a fulcrum, the human replied. Several species began talking at once. Warnings, objections, equations thrown like shields. The oxygen counter dipped again, its steady countdown a quiet drumbeat beneath the rising tension. 3 minutes. The human dragged the brace toward the door inch by inch, boots slipping on the deck as their muscles protested. Their breathing grew harsher, sweat darkening their clothing. Every movement was effort layered on pain. This is pointless, the engineer said. Even if you gain leverage, the force required drops. The human finished, bracing the end of the strut against the frame. Not to zero, just to something I can work with. They wedged the brace into the gap at an angle, adjusting it carefully, testing resistance with small pushes rather than full effort. Each adjustment made the sensors chirp warnings. Structural stress climbed into ranges that made the station's automated systems hesitate, unsure whether to intervene or observe. The human paused, forehead pressed to the metal, breathing slow and controlled. Everyone back, they said quietly. No, the Kalrith protested. If that slips. It won't, the human said. Then, after a beat, probably. That did not help. The humans set their feet, one against the door frame, one against the deck, and leaned into the brace. Not suddenly, not violently, gradually, steadily, like someone pushing a stalled ground vehicle out of mud. The brace bent. Not much, but enough. The door shrieked. The sound was unbearable, metal grinding against metal, pressure screaming through the rails as centuries of design assumptions were violated at once. The gap widened another few centimeters, light spilling through like a promise. The station screamed too, alarms cascading as stress tolerances were exceeded. Stop, the engineer shouted. You're exceeding. The human roared. Not in anger. In effort. Every muscle stood out in sharp relief beneath their skin. Veins bulged. Their face contorted as pain flooded and unchecked. The monitors showed damage accumulating rapidly. Tears, strain, microfractures forming faster than the system could log them. The brace slipped. Just a little. Enough to steal leverage. The humans stumbled, catching themselves on the frame, gasping for breath. The gap remained, did not close, but did not widen either. For a moment, it seemed like that was it. Then the human laughed. A short, breathless sound. Oh, they said hoarsely. I get it now. No one asked what they meant. They repositioned the brace lower, closer to the point of maximum binding. Adjusted the angle by degrees, not guesses. They wiped sweat from their eyes, inhaled once, deeply. This door, the human said, voice trembling but steady, was designed so no one would ever try this. Which means no one planned for someone who would. They leaned in again. And this time, the door moved. Not a fraction. Not a whisper. It slid. Slowly. Reluctantly. With a scream that echoed down the corridor as the impossible finally gave way to persistence. The gap was now wide enough to see the other side. Wide enough to crawl through. Wide enough to live. And every species present stared in stunned silence. Not at the door, but at the human, realizing all at once that the most dangerous thing in the room was not the failing station. It was the species that looked at an immovable wall and decided to fix it. The moment the door began to slide, panic shifted shape. It was no longer the sharp, helpless fear of suffocation. It became something worse, disbelief layered with the terror of watching reality fail. The emergency bulkhead was not supposed to move. Every species present knew that. Their education, their engineering standards, their safety doctrines were built around that certainty. The door was not a challenge. It was a fact, and facts did not grind and shriek under human effort. "Stop," the engineer whispered, not shouting now, not commanding, pleading. "If the rail fractures." The human didn't answer. They couldn't. Every breath was work now, dragged in against the crushing weight of effort and the screaming protest of muscles pushed far beyond comfort. Their face had gone red, then pale, then something in between as blood pressure spiked unpredictably. The brace trembled violently in their hands. The door continued to move. Millimeter by millimeter, the bulkhead slid along warped rails, shedding flakes of scorched alloy as friction fought every centimeter. The stress alarms rose in pitch until the sound bordered on painful, overlapping with the station's emergency sirens in a discordant chorus. "Oxygen remaining. 2 minutes," the station announced calmly. "Human," the Calrith said urgently, voice quavering. "You must stop. You will not survive this." The human exhaled through clenched teeth. "Yeah," they rasped. "But you might." They shifted their stance again, adjusting for the door's new position. Every change in angle sent fresh spikes of pain through their body. The monitors screamed warnings. Structural strain in the human skeletal system now rivaled that of the door itself. The gap was wide enough now for light, air, and hope, but not enough for evacuation. Not yet. The Brenni moved forward instinctively, massive frame looming behind the human. "Let me assist," they said, placing their bulk near the brace. "No." The human snapped, sharper than before. "You'll push straight. That'll jam it again." They didn't look back as they spoke, eyes locked on the metal edge, reading its resistance like a living thing. "It's twisted," the human continued, voice strained. "It doesn't want force. It wants correction." Another push. The brace bent further. The human screamed. Not loudly, not theatrically. A raw, involuntary sound torn free by pain that could no longer be swallowed. Blood trickled from their nose as internal pressure spiked dangerously. Their knees buckled for a heartbeat before they locked again, refusing collapse. "Stop," several voices shouted at once. The human didn't. They did something else instead. They changed how they pushed. Less weight. More angle. A subtle shift that no engineer would have programmed and no alien body could have maintained under this strain. The brace creaked, then settled. The door shuttered. And then, finally, it yielded. The bulkhead slid another half-meter before grinding to a halt, jammed again, but no longer sealing the corridor. The opening was now large enough for evacuation, awkward, dangerous, but possible. The station alarms changed tone. Atmospheric equalization detected, the system announced. Evacuation route viable. No one moved. They were all staring at the human. The human released the brace and collapsed forward, caught by the frame just before hitting the deck. Their body shook uncontrollably as adrenaline bled away, leaving only pain and exhaustion behind. Medics rushed forward, scanners flashing as they assessed injuries piling up faster than treatment protocols could account for. "Multiple microfractures," one said. "Severe muscle tearing. Internal hemorrhaging risk." The human waved them off weakly. "Door's gonna slip back," they gasped. "Someone wedge it." The Brenni reacted instantly, slamming their bulk into position to hold the gap, while others scrambled to secure the opening. The humans slumped to the floor, vision tunneling, breath shallow. As evacuees began crawling through the gap, one by one, the engineers stood frozen, staring at the warped rails and bent brace. "It should not have moved," they whispered. The human looked up at them, eyes unfocused but still faintly amused. "Yeah," they said hoarsely. That's what I kept thinking. They coughed, wincing as pain flared again. It should move, they added softly. It's just stuck. And in that moment, as the impossible doorway remained open because one human refused to accept it as final, the galaxy's oldest assumption cracked wide open. Because something that should not move had. Not because it was designed to, but because someone had decided it needed to. Once evacuation began, the corridor changed. Panic gave way to urgency, and urgency to coordination. Species that moments ago had been frozen by disbelief now moved with purpose, guiding one another through the narrow opening the human had forced into existence. It was not graceful. It was not safe. But it was movement, and movement meant survival. The door did not like being open. Every few seconds it groaned, the warped rails flexing as gravity and internal stress tried to drag it back into place. The brace creaked ominously under the Brenthy's weight, alloy screaming as it bore a load it was never meant to sustain. "How long will it hold?" someone shouted. The engineer checked their console, mandibles twitching in agitation. "Unknown. Structural integrity is compromised. Any estimate would be guesswork." The human lay on their side near the frame, chest rising and falling unevenly as medics worked frantically to stabilize them. Blood stained the floor beneath their nose and mouth. Their hands shook uncontrollably, fingers curling and uncurling as nerve impulses misfired. They were still conscious. "It's not going to slide all at once," the human said weakly, eyes half-lidded. "It'll jerk. Watch the bottom rail." The engineer stared. "How do you know that?" "Because," the human rasped, "that's what stuck things do when you piss them off." Despite themselves, the engineer followed the instruction. When the rail twitched moments later, exactly as predicted, a shudder rippled through the group. The human had not lifted the door. They had read it. Evacuation continued in waves. Smaller species first, slipping through with assistance. Larger ones followed, scraping against the jagged metal edges as they passed. Each movement threatened to destabilize the opening. A Kalrith misjudged their angle and clipped the brace. The door lurched inward with a thunderous clang, crushing the air from every lung in the corridor. The Brenthi roared and pushed back, muscles straining to hold the gap. The human cried out involuntarily, pain flaring in sympathetic response as the door shifted. "Stop," the medics began. "No," the human whispered. "They're almost through." The oxygen counter dipped into its final minute. Sweat poured down the Brenthy's face now, breath coming in harsh gasps as their strength approached its own limits. They could not hold this forever. The human forced themselves onto one elbow. "Hey," they croaked to the engineer. "When it starts to go, don't fight it. Guide it." The engineer shook their head. "I don't understand." "Exactly," the human said, managing a faint grin. "You don't have to lift it. Just keep it from slamming." As if on cue, the brace finally bent too far. With a sound like a breaking bone, it snapped. The door surged inward. The Brenthi staggered back, losing leverage. Screams erupted as evacuees scrambled to avoid being crushed. The human moved. They shouldn't have been able to. Every warning the medics had issued became irrelevant as the human dragged themselves forward, bracing their shoulder against the edge of the door, using their own body as a buffer to slow its movement. The pain must have been unimaginable. They screamed this time, loud, raw, uncontrolled, as the door crushed into them, their body absorbing force that would have shattered reinforced plating. But the motion slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Enough. The engineer reacted on instinct, grabbing a fallen support strut and slamming it into place beside the human's shoulder, wedging the door at a new angle. The door slammed to a halt inches from sealing completely. Silence fell, broken only by ragged breathing and distant alarms. The last evacuee crawled through. Atmosphere stabilized. Rescue teams flooded the corridor moments later. The human lay motionless beneath the brace, eyes closed, face gray. Medics rushed in, hauling the door back just enough to free them. For a terrible second, no one knew if they were alive. Then the human coughed weakly. The engineer sank to the floor, staring at the ruined bulkhead. They didn't lift it, they murmured. They never tried to. The Brenthi looked down at the unconscious human, reverence in their massive eyes. "They pried the impossible open," they said softly. And for the first time since the station was built, someone understood the flaw in its design. It had been engineered against force. It had never been designed to withstand stubbornness. The investigation began before the human regained consciousness. Engineers sealed the corridor, not for safety. There was no longer any danger, but for disbelief. The emergency bulkhead sat half open, rails warped, locking teeth shaved down to bright scars where they had scraped and screamed against one another. It looked wounded. Machines were not supposed to look wounded. The Threxian engineering lead ran trembling appendages along the exposed mechanisms, scanners chirping in confusion. The locking array functioned correctly, they said. The mass tolerances were within spec. The failure mode, they stopped, mandibles clicking as the system recalculated again, does not exist in our library. It didn't fail, the Calrith replied quietly. It was forced. That is not the same thing. The Threxian snapped, then faltered. It should be. The human lay in the medical bay nearby, wrapped in stabilizers and monitored by a forest of blinking lights. Their injuries were extensive, tears, fractures, pressure damage, but survivable. Barely. The medical staff spoke in hushed tones, not out of fear for the patient, but out of fear for the implications. This should not be possible, a surgeon said. Not without mechanical assistance. It wasn't assistance, the engineer replied. It was interference. They replayed the footage frame by frame. The angled pushes, the pauses, the way the humans stopped applying force when resistance peaked, then resumed from a new vector. No single moment exceeded design load by enough to trigger catastrophic failure. Instead, stress accumulated unevenly, migrating through joints and rails the system assumed would never be stressed asymmetrically. The door was designed against lifting, the engineer murmured. Against straight force. Against leverage applied uniformly. The Calrith folded their tendrils. Because no species applies force like that. Because no species can, the engineer corrected. Not while standing. Not while breathing. They pulled up comparative data, homeworld gravities, muscle density, skeletal reinforcement across known species. Humans ranked unremarkably in raw strength. Their averages were mediocre. Their extremes, however, told a different story. They evolved under sustained gravity higher than station standard, the engineer said slowly. Their musculoskeletal system is accustomed to constant load, microadjustments, continuous compensation, and pain tolerance, the Calrith asked. Unreliable metric, the engineer replied. They experience pain normally. They simply ignore it longer. The room went quiet. Design assumptions scrolled across the central display. Thousands of them. Most never questioned because they had never needed to be. No biological entity will attempt prolonged asymmetrical force application against a Class V seal. Emergency doors will only ever be opposed by pressure differentials or mechanical tools. And if those assumptions are wrong, the Calrith asked. The engineer did not answer immediately. If those assumptions are wrong, they said at last, then a great many things we consider immovable are merely untested. In the medical bay, the humans stirred. Their eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as awareness returned. Pain registered immediately, visible in the tightening of their jaw, the sharp intake of breath. A medic leaned in, voice calm, reassuring. You're safe, they said. The evacuation succeeded. The human swallowed. Door. Still open, the medic replied. Barely. A faint smile touched the human's lips. Told you. The engineer stood at the foot of the bed, data pad clutched like a shield. Why? They asked abruptly. Why did you keep pushing when it was clearly beyond you? The human blinked at them. Because it wasn't beyond me, they said. It was just resisting. That distinction is meaningless, the engineer said. The human shook their head slightly, then winced. On my world, they said, things don't stop being problems just because they're heavy. Doors jam. Engines seize. Debris shifts. If you wait for perfect conditions, you die. So you learn how to make imperfect ones work. They closed their eyes, exhaustion pulling them back. You built the door to beat force, the human added softly. You didn't build it to beat people who won't quit. Later, as repair crews struggled to realign the bulkhead, using tools and power systems far exceeding what the human had used, the engineer logged the final report. Cause of incident: unanticipated biological interference. Contributing factors: persistence, asymmetry, pain tolerance beyond design parameters. They hesitated, then added a note not required by protocol. Future designs should account for human presence. It was the first time those words appeared in an emergency architecture file, and it would not be the last. The station did not return to normal. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Repairs were completed within hours. Power rerouted. Pressure stabilized. Emergency protocols cleared. On paper, the crisis ended cleanly, efficiently, and according to regulation. But the behavior of the station changed, not mechanically, but socially. Conversations paused when the human walked by. Maintenance crews reinforced equipment that had never before required reinforcement. Engineers started muttering phrases like human-rated and biological override risk, as if those had always been part of the lexicon. The human, for their part, did something far more unsettling than celebrating. They apologized. "I didn't mean to cause problems," the human said to the facility's supervisor while still wrapped in medical braces. "I just needed the door open." The supervisor stared at them for several seconds before replying. "You displaced a Class V bulkhead." "Yeah, but it was stuck," the human said, genuinely confused. "If the handle had worked, I wouldn't have touched it." That answer spread faster than the incident footage. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't pride. It was normalcy. The human did not frame their actions as heroic, exceptional, or even noteworthy. They treated the event the way another species might describe lifting a fallen chair or shoving debris out of a hallway. That terrified people. In the following days, committees formed. Not emergency committees, those already existed, but review committees. Architectural boards. Safety councils. Xenobiology task forces. One by one, they reached the same conclusion, though none liked saying it aloud. The human had not broken the system. The system had been built under the assumption that no one would ever try that hard. A senior safety analyst presented a quiet report to the council. "We have always categorized strength as a peak output variable," they said. "Maximum force. Maximum torque. What we failed to model is duration. Humans apply force not as a spike, but as a sustained negotiation." "A negotiation?" someone asked. "Yes," the analyst replied. "They don't overpower resistance immediately. They argue with it. They test it. They wait. Then they push again." That concept unsettled the room. Military observers requested access to the footage. Then industrial guilds. Then civilian transit authorities. Doors, gates, restraints. Entire categories of design were suddenly under review. Meanwhile, the human returned to work. Not to fame. Not to accolades. Just work. They asked if anyone needed help moving equipment during repairs. They carried crates that machines usually handled. They held beams in place while welders worked. Every time someone tried to stop them, citing safety concerns, the human complied immediately and waited, patient, polite, unoffended. That, too, unnerved people. "Why aren't they exploiting this?" one administrator asked quietly. "Exploiting what?" another replied. "Their advantage." The answer came from a xenopsychologist observing from afar. "Because humans don't perceive it as an advantage," she said. "They perceive it as responsibility." That statement silenced the room. On the fifth day, a junior engineer finally asked the question no one else wanted to phrase. "What happens if humans decide not to be careful?" No one answered right away, because the truth was obvious and deeply uncomfortable. Nothing in current infrastructure accounted for that scenario. The human was summoned, not for interrogation, but for consultation. They arrived wearing a borrowed brace, posture still stiff, movements slower than before. The council chamber felt smaller with them inside, though no one could explain why. "We need to understand," the chairperson said carefully, "how you knew the door could be moved." The human thought for a moment. "I didn't," they said. "I just knew it hadn't won yet." Silence. "You understand," the chairperson continued, "that most species would have stopped." The human nodded. "Yeah, that makes sense." "And you didn't?" The human shrugged slightly. Someone was on the other side. That was it. No philosophy. No justification. Just fact. After the meeting, as the human left, one engineer leaned toward another and whispered, "We didn't design for heroes." The others shook their heads slowly. "No," they said. "We didn't design for humans doing what they consider normal." That night, the station's master systems quietly updated a line in its adaptive safety protocols. Assume human persistence. It wasn't enough, but it was the first step toward admitting the truth. Humans weren't dangerous because they were strong. They were dangerous because they kept going after everyone else decided it was impossible. And that realization was only beginning to sink in. The first official change came quietly. No announcement, no ceremony, just a line updated in the Galactic Infrastructure Registry at 3:17 station time. The kind of update that normally went unnoticed, buried among thousands of routine revisions. Emergency containment systems, human interaction risk, reassessment pending. By morning, half the station had already noticed. Engineers arriving for shift found new access flags on their consoles. Doors that had once been labeled biologically immovable were now marked conditionally secure. Load simulations auto-ran when a human entered a restricted corridor. Maintenance drones adjusted their behavior, increasing standoff distance by fractions of a meter that meant nothing to machines and everything to flesh. The human noticed none of it. They were in physical therapy, grimacing through carefully controlled movements while a Velcrin medic monitored muscle response. The damage from the bulkhead incident was healing well, better than expected, but the human pushed anyway, asking when they could return to full duty. Soon, the medic said firmly. Not now. The human sighed, frustrated not by pain, but by limitation. Across the station, the reclassification spread, first to infrastructure, then to logistics, then, inevitably, to security. A closed-door meeting convened with representatives from 3 fleets, 2 megacorporations, and 1 deeply nervous legal counsel. The agenda was short. Are humans a structural hazard? No, one analyst argued. They are statistically rare. Incorrect, another countered. They are currently rare. Charts appeared, population growth curves, colonization rates, migration projections. Humans were not slow. They did not linger. Where they arrived, they stayed. Where they stayed, systems adapted or broke. Then restrict them, a security officer suggested. A xenopolitical advisor shook their head. You cannot restrict a species for being capable. Can you? Someone asked. If their capabilities invalidate safety assumptions? That question lingered. Meanwhile, stories spread beyond the station. Not the official report. Not the technical analysis. The story. A human forcing open an emergency door while alarms screamed. A body that refused to quit when oxygen ran low. A question asked in confusion instead of fear. Why is it stuck? Across the galaxy, reactions varied. Some laughed. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Some, especially those from high-risk professions, paid very close attention. On a mining outpost near a neutron star, a foreman quietly requested human consultants. On a frontier colony with aging infrastructure, a mayor sent an inquiry about human-rated repairs. In a military academy, a lecturer paused mid-class and rewrote an exam question. Assuming a human is present, recalculate failure thresholds. Back on the station, the council reached a compromise. Humans would not be restricted, but they would be reclassified, not as a threat, as a variable, a living, breathing factor that could not be safely averaged out. The final wording was precise, careful, and deeply unsettling. Human persistence exceeds standard biological cessation models. Systems interacting with humans must account for sustained force application beyond assumed endurance limits. When the document circulated, one junior clerk stared at it for a long time before whispering, "We're rewriting physics because one person didn't stop." They weren't wrong. The human was informed last. A representative met them in the rehabilitation wing, explaining the changes in gentle, diplomatic tones. The human listened politely, nodding along, brow furrowed. "So," they said when it was done, "you're changing signs and rules because I tried to help?" "Yes," the representative admitted. The human scratched the back of their neck. "That seems like a lot." "It is," the representative agreed. "But it's necessary." The human considered this, then smiled faintly. "If it makes things safer, I guess that's good." Safer. The word echoed strangely in the mind of everyone who heard it. Because the galaxy was beginning to understand something fundamental. Humans didn't break limits to prove a point. They broke them because, to a human, a limit was just the place you stopped trying. And now the galaxy had to decide whether it would adapt, or be forced to. The test was never announced. That was deliberate. If humans reacted differently when they knew they were being observed, the data would be compromised. That was the official justification, at least. The unspoken reason was simpler. No one wanted to admit they were afraid of what they might learn. So the station ran a drill. A routine one, logged as a power fluctuation in a secondary maintenance ring. Emergency lights engaged at 70%. Environmental pressure dropped just enough to be uncomfortable, not dangerous. Doors sealed according to protocol. Nothing dramatic. Nothing heroic. Except there was a human in the section. Not the human. Another one. A cargo systems technician assigned only 3 weeks earlier. Smaller than the first. Older. Visibly less athletic. The kind of human most profiles labeled non-exceptional. Perfect. From the control room, analysts watched feeds light up as the technician noticed the pressure change. He paused, frowned at the status panel, and tapped the side of it once, as if coaxing it into behaving. "Control," he said into his voice calm. "I think your door's having a bad day." The response came quickly. "Stand by. Rescue teams en route. Estimated arrival." "How long?" the human asked. The pause on the other end lasted a fraction too long. 6 minutes, the controller said. The human looked at the sealed door, looked at the gauge ticking slowly downward, then at the crate blocking the corridor behind him. Heavy, industrial, immovable by most standards. He exhaled, rolled his shoulders. "Yeah," he said. "That's a bit long." In the control room, several beings leaned forward. He didn't rush the door. That was the first surprise. Instead, he dragged the crate closer, grunting with effort, boots sliding on the deck. He wedged it beneath the emergency door's lower lip, testing angles, adjusting placement. When the crate didn't quite fit, he cursed softly and tipped it, using his body weight to lever it into position. The door didn't move. He stopped, rested his hands on his knees, breathed. Then he tried again, this time pushing up on the crate while pulling the door sideways with one hand, creating a torsion the designers had never modeled. The strain showed immediately. Veins stood out on his neck. His face reddened. The door screamed, a high, metallic whine of protest that echoed through the corridor. "Stop," someone whispered in the control room. He didn't. He paused when his arms shook too badly to hold position. Backed off, shook out his hands, then repositioned again, changing leverage by centimeters. The door crept upward. Not much. A finger's width. Enough to tell him it wasn't impossible. "Okay," the human muttered. "That's something." He wedged his shoulder beneath the rising gap and leaned. The pressure alarm ticked lower. Rescue ETA dropped to 4 minutes. The door rose another inch. Control room chatter spiked. "This is exceeding predicted output." "He's not exceeding it," an analyst replied quietly. "He's sustaining it." Sweat dripped onto the deck. The human's breathing grew ragged, but he kept adjusting, shifting weight, rebalancing load. Every micro-movement was instinctive, learned over years of hauling, lifting, fixing things that didn't want to be fixed. When the door reached knee height, he kicked the crate further under and let it take part of the load. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "Man," he said between breaths, "you guys really overbuild these things." In the control room, no one laughed back. Rescue arrived to find the door partially open, braced by a crate, and a human sitting against the wall beside it, arms trembling, chest heaving, but alive. "Door was stuck," he told them cheerfully. "Figured I'd help." Medical scans later showed micro tears, strained ligaments, dangerously elevated stress markers. The report flagged all of it. But the conclusion was what mattered. Human subject displayed identical behavioral patterns to previous incident despite lower physical profile. One analyst closed the file slowly. "So it's not outliers," they said. "No," another replied. "It's baseline." That night, the registry updated again. Human persistence is not exceptional behavior. It is typical. And with that understanding came a realization far more unsettling than strength or endurance. You didn't need a hero. Any human would do. The galaxy did not panic. That surprised everyone later. There were no emergency summits, no mass evacuations, no declarations labeling humans as threats or weapons or living violations of safety law. Instead, something far stranger happened. The galaxy adjusted. Slowly at first. Quietly. The way intelligent systems always do when denial stops being useful. Design standards changed. Not publicly, at least not at first, but in footnotes, annexes, and revised appendices. Emergency bulkheads gained secondary release tolerances. Structural load simulations added a new variable labeled simply H factor. It wasn't defined in detail. It didn't need to be. Everyone knew what it meant. When the first interstellar manufacturer released a human-compatible safety door, it sold out in hours. When a mining consortium advertised stations rated for Class 7 Death World species, humans were specifically named in the fine print. When a colonial governor asked for disaster response volunteers, they quietly requested at least one human per team. Not because humans were invincible, because they didn't stop when things got hard. The human who opened the door returned to duty 2 weeks later. There was no ceremony, no medal, just a new brace on their shoulder and a quiet request from facilities to please notify engineering before attempting further manual interventions. They agreed. Honestly, they meant it. And yet, 3 days later, they were spotted holding a warped support beam in place while drones repaired a ceiling section, because waiting would have meant another evacuation, and the human had decided that was unnecessary. Someone had to keep it up, they explained afterward. The phrase became infamous. In academic circles, the incident sparked debate that lasted years. Was human persistence an evolutionary fluke? A psychological quirk? A cultural artifact born from dangerous worlds and unreliable tools? The answer, frustratingly, was yes. Humans evolved where gravity punished weakness, weather killed carelessness, and survival favored those who kept moving even when injured, afraid, or exhausted. Over time, their bodies adapted, but more importantly, so did their minds. Stopping was not safety. Stopping was death. The galaxy had never needed that mindset before. It had relied on margins, redundancies, and rules, on machines that failed predictably and species that respected limits instinctively. Humans respected limits too, but only after testing them personally. That difference changed everything. Emergency training manuals were rewritten. The phrase "await rescue" was quietly supplemented with "unless a human is present." Liability clauses grew longer. Insurance premiums shifted. Entire professions emerged around human risk mediation, specialists trained to tell humans when not to help. They were not always successful. The human in question was eventually interviewed for a xenohistorical archive. The interviewer, a careful, nervous scholar, asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Knowing what you know now," they said, "would you do it again?" The human didn't answer immediately. They looked at their hands, at the faint scars that hadn't quite faded, at the brace they still wore when lifting anything heavy. Then they nodded. "Yeah," they said, "probably. Even if it hurts you, especially then." The interviewer hesitated. "Why?" The human shrugged. "Because if I can do something and I don't, that sticks with you. Pain fades. That doesn't." The archive entry ended there. But the galaxy kept listening. Years later, when a frontier station lost power during a meteor strike, the evacuation report included a single line that every engineer now recognized. Outcome improved due to human presence. No explanation followed. None was needed. Because by then, the galaxy understood the truth behind the question that had started everything. The emergency door hadn't been stuck. It had been waiting for someone who refused to accept that impossible meant stop.